The sirens of life never seemed to bother Amy Foster. As a nurse in the downtown ER, she'd learned to tune out the chaos, the beeping monitors, the screaming patients, the never-ending shuffle of gurneys through overcrowded corridors. But that afternoon, as she stepped out to grab a coffee from the cart across the street, something pierced through the noise. A man slumped on the sidewalk just beyond the hospital's emergency bay. At first, she thought he was homeless, a common sight in this part of the city. But something about the way he was breathing, shallow and rapid, told her it was more than that. His jacket was torn at the sleeves, but barely visible beneath it was a faded military patch. U.S. Army. Infantry. Amy rushed to him without a second thought. "Sir? Can you hear me?" He opened his eyes slowly. Clouded. Confused. Sweat clung to his brow even though the wind had a bite to it. "Chest hurts." "Okay. You're going to be all right," she said, pressing her fingers gently to his pulse. It was irregular, erratic. Possibly cardiac. She called for a wheelchair and waved over an orderly. "Let's get him inside." But the moment they crossed the sliding glass doors, a voice barked from behind the desk. "Whoa, whoa, what's this?" It was Charles Brenner, the night administrator. A numbers man. The kind of person who cared more about insurance forms than beating hearts. Amy didn't flinch. "He's having a cardiac episode. No time to waste." "Is he insured?" Brenner asked, flipping open a clipboard. Amy paused. "He's a veteran." "Probably not." "I don't know yet." "Then he needs to wait for public emergency services. We don't admit without coverage unless it's a trauma call or court order. You know that." Her fists clenched. "Are we really doing this again? This man is about to crash. You know the protocol." "Screw protocol." Amy grabbed the crash cart herself and wheeled it over. "I'll take responsibility," she snapped. "He's going in." Brenner looked like he wanted to argue, but Amy was already pushing the man toward the cardiac bay. She worked fast: oxygen, ECG leads, nitroglycerin spray. The old man's breathing started to slow. His color returned. "Name?" she asked softly. He blinked. "Harlan. Staff Sergeant. 101st Airborne." Amy smiled. "Well, Staff Sergeant Harlan, you're safe now." But the warmth didn't last long. An hour later, after Harlan had stabilized and been moved to a holding room, Amy was called into the administrator's office. Brenner was waiting with the HR director and a printed report. "You violated hospital protocol, admitted an uninsured patient without authorization, and used critical resources without clearance." Amy looked at them, stunned. "I saved a life." "You went against direct instruction. You're suspended effective immediately. Clean out your locker." It was like being punched in the chest. Amy walked out, her badge in her hand, the hospital halls suddenly unfamiliar. Outside, the wind had picked up. She looked back once more. Harlan was still there, somewhere inside. Alive. That's what mattered. But she had no idea what was coming next. Because just a few hours later, the military showed up. The hospital was calm as any emergency room could be on a weekday afternoon. Patients whispered. Nurses moved between bays like quiet ghosts. But the calm shattered when 3 black SUVs pulled up outside the emergency entrance. Security didn't even have time to react before the doors opened. 6 uniformed men stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with military precision. Leading them was a tall African-American officer in full dress blues. His chest bore rows of ribbons and medals that glinted beneath the hospital lights. A man used to being obeyed. Colonel David Marshall, U.S. Army Medical Corps. He wasn't here for a courtesy visit. "Excuse me," he said to the front desk nurse. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge." The receptionist stammered, Mr. Brenner, the administrator, is in his office." Colonel Marshall nodded once. "Good." He didn't wait for permission. He and his men walked straight through the glass doors and down the hall. All heads turned. Whispers trailed in their wake. Brenner looked up from his computer as the group entered his office without knocking. "Can I help?" "You can sit down, Mr. Brenner," Marshall said calmly. "We'll keep this brief." Behind him, one of the officers pulled out a printed statement. "We've reviewed the body cam footage from the city security cameras outside your ER entrance," Marshall continued. "We've confirmed that Staff Sergeant Harlan Barnes collapsed outside your hospital yesterday. He is a decorated veteran with 22 years of active service, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He suffered a cardiac arrhythmia. He would have died on your sidewalk if not for the actions of Nurse Amy Foster." Brenner swallowed. "She violated. She saved his life," Marshall interrupted, his tone still composed but ice-cold. "And you punished her for it." The room was silent. "You suspended her," Marshall added. "For saving a man who wore the same uniform as I do. That doesn't sit well with us." Brenner tried to rally. "We have policies. Insurance protocols. If we don't follow them, the hospital—" "What you follow," Marshall said, taking a step closer, "is a system designed to turn people away unless they can pay up front. But let me be very clear, when your staff turns away a veteran in crisis, it becomes our concern. And when your staff punishes someone for doing the right thing, it becomes my personal concern." He placed a folded letter on Brenner's desk. "This is an official request from the Department of Defense. We're requesting Amy Foster be immediately reinstated to her position pending internal review. And we'd like her to be recognized for her service to a veteran of the United States Armed Forces." "And if we don't comply?" Brenner asked, though his voice lacked conviction. The colonel's gaze didn't waver. "Then we make this story public. All of it. Including your name." A long pause. Then, "Understood," Brenner said quietly. Meanwhile, Amy sat at home on her couch, still in scrubs, staring at her badge and wondering if she'd ever wear it again. The knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she gasped. Colonel Marshall stood before her, flanked by two of his officers. "Amy Foster," he asked with a warm smile. "We owe you a thank you." She blinked, stunned. "What?" "We have something to discuss," he said, handing her an envelope. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a formal commendation letter from the U.S. Army, and something else. A hospital reinstatement order. Effective immediately. Amy looked up, tears already rising. "Why would you?" "Because Staff Sergeant Barnes is one of ours," Marshall said. "And now, so are you." The next morning, the hospital buzzed like a stirred beehive. Something had changed. Whispers rippled through the halls. Phones pinged with news articles. An anonymous source had leaked the story overnight to a local veteran advocacy group, and from there, it spread like wildfire. ER nurse suspended for saving veteran, reinstated after military intervention. Colonel confronts hospital over treatment of decorated war hero. Local hero, Amy Foster's act of compassion sparks national conversation. Amy arrived at the hospital's side entrance, unsure what to expect. She hadn't slept. The commendation letter still felt surreal in her hands, the crisp edges reminding her it wasn't a dream. Waiting for her at the door was Dr. Reyes, the head of cardiology and one of the few allies she had on staff. "Morning," he said with a crooked smile. "Welcome back, troublemaker." She gave him a tired laugh. "Didn't think I'd be walking through these doors again." He handed her a fresh badge. "They made it official this morning. And I heard something else. Colonel Marshall's team is hosting a press statement here, today." Amy blinked. "Here? Why?" "You'll see." At noon, the hospital lobby was packed. Not just with staff, but with journalists, veterans in uniform, and patients who had heard the buzz and wheeled their IVs close enough to watch. Brenner stood stiffly near the podium, flanked by hospital executives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Colonel Marshall stepped forward, crisp and commanding, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Good afternoon. Today, we recognize an act of courage. Not on the battlefield, but in a place where compassion sometimes bows to bureaucracy. He paused, looking directly at Amy, who stood near the back, stunned. Nurse Amy Foster acted on instinct, humanity, and her oath as a caregiver. When no one else would act, she stepped in and saved the life of Staff Sergeant Harlan Barnes. Her actions remind us that kindness doesn't wait for policy approval. Applause broke out, not the polite kind, but the kind that swells, rises, and doesn't stop. Colonel Marshall waited until it faded. Today, on behalf of the United States Army and the thousands of veterans she represents, we commend her. Amy Foster, please step forward. Amy hesitated, heart pounding. The crowd parted for her. She walked slowly, cheeks burning, eyes wide. The colonel handed her a framed certificate bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense and her name in bold letters. He also pinned a silver lapel badge on her chest, an honor rarely given to civilians. Then he leaned closer and whispered, "We've got your back now." The room erupted again, louder this time. Even some of the senior doctors clapped. A few nurses whistled. Someone shouted, "That's our Amy." And then, almost unnoticed, Staff Sergeant Barnes was wheeled into the room. He looked fragile but smiled warmly as he saluted her from the chair. Amy choked back a sob and returned the salute, eyes glistening. He whispered hoarsely, "You didn't let me die." "Thank you." In the back of the room, Brenner adjusted his tie and slipped quietly out the side door. His time in charge was no longer guaranteed. The system had shown its cracks. And the world had seen who stood tall inside them. By the next morning, Amy's story was everywhere. Cable news anchors dissected it. Radio talk shows debated policy. Social media blew up with hashtags. Hashtag stand with Amy. Hashtag honor our veterans. Hashtag nurses before paperwork. Her inbox overflowed with messages, hundreds of them. Some were from fellow nurses thanking her for speaking up. Some were from veterans. One message simply read, "My dad died alone in a hallway because they wouldn't treat him. What you did matters." Amy sat at her kitchen table, still in her pajamas, reading every word with trembling fingers. She didn't feel like a hero. She hadn't wanted attention. She had just done what she believed was right. But now, the world was watching. At the hospital, the fallout had only just begun. Brenner's office door remained shut most of the day. Rumors swirled, upper-level review, board meetings, possible resignation. And among the staff, something else was shifting, something Amy hadn't expected. People who once rolled their eyes at her emotional way of working were suddenly stopping her in the hallway. Nurses who had never spoken to her beyond shift reports now lingered, asking if she was okay. Even the prickly Dr. Keller offered a quiet, "Good job, Foster," before disappearing into an exam room. But not everyone was pleased. She overheard one surgeon scoffing in the break room. "Great, so now we reward insubordination?" Another administrator said, "Let's see if anyone volunteers to pay the hospital's legal bills when the board comes calling." Amy didn't respond. She just kept moving. She knew the line she'd crossed. And she didn't regret it. A few days later, Colonel Marshall returned, not with press this time, but with news. They'd launched a national initiative inspired by Amy's case. A pilot program that would partner with local hospitals to ensure veterans without insurance could still receive emergency care, funded directly through a Department of Defense reserve. "Your story was the spark," he told her. "And now it's going to help a lot more people than just Barnes." Amy's eyes filled with tears again. He smiled. "But we also came to offer you something else." She blinked. "Me?" "Yes. We'd like you to speak at the National Nurses Summit in D.C. next month. Keynote speaker. To share your experience. Unfiltered." Her breath caught. I don't know what I'd even say." "You'll figure it out," he said kindly. "All you have to do is speak from the place that made you act that day." She nodded slowly. "I can do that." That night, Amy visited Harlan again. He was healing slowly, still weak but sharper now. They sat by the window, watching city lights flicker in the dark. "You look different," he said with a half-smile. "Famous, even." Amy chuckled. "I'd trade all the fame just to make sure this never happens to another vet." He nodded solemnly. "It's bigger than both of us now." A long pause. Then he looked her straight in the eyes. "Thank you for seeing me as more than just another tired old man on a sidewalk." Amy didn't speak. She just reached over and took his hand. But the storm wasn't over yet. Because while the world cheered, the hospital board was meeting behind closed doors. And not everyone liked what Amy represented. The email came late in the evening. Subject: upcoming hearing, administrative review. Amy stared at it, lips pressed into a hard line. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a date, a time, and a vague sentence about reviewing recent procedural violations and external influences on hospital operations. She didn't need to read between the lines. The board wasn't done with her yet. That Friday morning, she walked into the hospital's largest conference room wearing her scrubs, no makeup, no armor, just herself. A panel of 6 board members sat behind a long oak table, folders spread before them. Their faces were a mix of unreadable neutrality and thinly veiled irritation. "Ms. Foster," the chairman began without preamble. "We're here to discuss the impact of your recent actions, not just on hospital protocol, but on public perception and administrative integrity." Amy didn't flinch. "You disobeyed direct instruction. You bypassed intake policies. And you brought national media attention to this facility without clearance." Silence. Then she replied, evenly, "And I saved a man's life." A few members shifted in their chairs. The chairman cleared his throat. "That's not in dispute. But this institution is not a charity. We rely on structure, not sentiment." Amy leaned forward slightly. "Structure didn't help Staff Sergeant Barnes when he collapsed outside our doors. It was sentiment that saved him. It was humanity. If your structure allows people to die on the curb, then maybe it's not as strong as you think." Another pause. This one heavier. One of the women on the board, Dr. Anita Lowe, an ICU chief, spoke up. "Let's be honest. This hospital wouldn't be on every news outlet if the military hadn't intervened. If that man hadn't been a veteran. If your story hadn't gone viral." Amy met her gaze. "So you're saying it matters who we save?" Lowe hesitated, then looked down at her notes. The air was thick with tension. Finally, the chairman closed his folder. "We'll render our decision in 48 hours. As Amy walked back through the lobby, she noticed something strange. Everywhere she turned, staff were watching her. Nurses nodded quietly. Orderlies gave her small smiles. Even some patients had caught wind of the hearing and whispered in the hallways as she passed. But it wasn't fear in their eyes. It was solidarity. She reached the elevators and found a sticky note taped to the button panel. It read, "We stand with you. ER night shift." Her hands trembled as she folded it and tucked it in her pocket. 2 days later, the verdict came. She was called back into the same room. This time, there were observers, legal advisors, senior doctors, and even a representative from the City Health Board. The chairman read from a prepared statement. "After reviewing all evidence, including footage, medical records, and community response, the board has decided." A long pause. "To close the disciplinary matter with no further action." Amy exhaled, just barely. The chairman continued, somewhat reluctantly, "We acknowledge the exceptional nature of this case. However, any future deviation from protocol must be routed through approved emergency override channels." Amy gave a slow, respectful nod. She understood what they were really saying. "You won, just don't make us lose face again." Outside the hearing room, the lobby erupted in applause. It wasn't staged. It wasn't forced. Staff, patients, even strangers waiting in wheelchairs, they clapped. Some whistled, A few had tears in their eyes. Amy froze, overwhelmed. And standing at the back, arms crossed with quiet pride, was Colonel Marshall. He didn't say a word. He just gave her a crisp salute. Amy returned it, with everything in her. But the journey wasn't over. Because something unexpected had begun to grow from the cracks. A movement. And Amy Foster? She was becoming its voice. It started small. A few emails. Then a phone call. Then a podcast host asked her to appear for a 15-minute segment. She agreed, nervous, unsure, voice shaking slightly as she spoke. But the response was overwhelming. Listeners flooded the comments. Nurses, paramedics, EMTs from across the country wrote in. We've been punished for doing the right thing too. You said what we've been too scared to say. You made us feel like we're not alone. Then came the invitations. Healthcare panels. Military forums. Advocacy groups. Amy Foster, a nurse from a city hospital no one had heard of, was becoming a national voice in the growing movement for ethical emergency care. Not political. Not angry. Just deeply human. I'm not against policy, she said at one event, standing before a room of hospital executives. But when protocol becomes a wall between someone's life and the help they need, we need to question who that system is really serving. She wasn't polished. She wasn't trained. But people listened because she was real. Back home, things had changed, too. The hospital quietly revised their intake policy for non-responsive patients without insurance. The clause was now nicknamed the Foster Amendment among staff. And Amy, she was different now. Not in a flashy way, but in her posture, in her eyes. She stood taller. Spoke with clarity. And no longer second-guessed the instinct that had guided her that day. Harlan, the veteran she saved, remained her friend. He visited the ER often, not as a patient anymore, but as a volunteer helping with triage logistics and mentoring younger staff about handling trauma cases. Feels good to be useful again, he told her one evening. After everything I saw in combat, I didn't think I'd find peace in a hospital. But here I am. She smiled. Funny. I didn't think I'd find courage outside of it. But here we are. One morning, Amy received a handwritten letter. No return address. Just a military-style envelope. Inside was a single card. Dear Amy. I'm the daughter of a Vietnam vet who died at a bus stop because he was turned away from 3 clinics. You don't know me, but I know what you did. And I wanted you to know, what you started is working. We see you. We support you. Don't stop. Amy stared at it for a long time. Sometimes, it felt like the system was too big, too tangled to change. But sometimes, just sometimes, she felt it shift. The final call came late one Friday evening. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We're launching a national ethics training module, the director said. We want your story to be the foundation. Real-world case study. A reminder that humanity must come first. Amy leaned back in her chair, stunned. We'd also like you to consult on development. Speak to medical students. Maybe even testify when the healthcare reform bill comes before the Senate next spring. She was silent. Then she nodded. I'd be honored. And just like that, the nurse who once thought she'd lost everything, became the woman who helped change everything. But one final chapter remained. And it came not with a medal or a headline, but with something far deeper. The snow fell softly that morning, quiet, peaceful, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Amy walked across the small cemetery lawn, a folded letter in her coat pocket and a single white rose in her hand. The wind caught her hair, but she didn't flinch. She just looked ahead, toward the modest gravestone with the name carved in clean, proud lettering. Staff Sergeant Harlan Barnes. 1963, 20XX. Still serving. He had passed just a week ago. Quietly. In his sleep. His heart, though stabilized that day on the ER table, had never fully recovered. But in the months he'd lived afterward, Harlan had lived more than in the last 10 years combined. He'd mentored students, spoken to young medics, written a column in a veterans newsletter titled From the Curb to Courage. And above all, he had been Amy's friend. She knelt beside the grave, brushing a bit of snow from the stone. "You kept your promise, Harlan," she whispered. "You served, even after the uniform." She placed the rose gently in the fresh snow. "And I'll keep mine." Later that day, back in her apartment, Amy opened her laptop to prepare for the keynote speech she would give next month in D.C., this time not just to nurses, but to Congress. But before she could begin, her phone buzzed. A message from a private number. "You don't know me, but I'm a medic stationed overseas. One of my guys forwarded me your story. I just wanted to say, we watch what happens back home. We see who stands up for us. Keep going. We've got your six." Amy smiled slowly. Somehow, this quiet act, the decision to help one man on a curb, had rippled through the world in ways she could never have imagined. A week later, she stood before a packed chamber on Capitol Hill. Behind her, projected on a screen, was a simple image, a faded surveillance photo from the ER entrance, showing Amy kneeling beside Harlan, holding his hand, her expression focused and fearless. She took a breath and began. "I'm not a politician. I'm not a CEO. I'm just a nurse. I don't know everything about laws or insurance codes, but I know what a heartbeat sounds like when it's fading. I know what fear looks like in someone's eyes when they think no one's coming." She paused. "And I know this, no one should have to die because they can't pay to stay alive. Not on my shift. Not ever again." Silence. Then thunderous applause. It was the kind of moment movies are made of, but this wasn't a movie. It was the story of one woman who chose compassion over compliance. Of a hospital that had to face its reflection. Of a system beginning to crack and the light beginning to shine through. And it all started with one decision. One voice. One heartbeat on the edge of stopping. And the nurse who refused to look away.